In a cardboard box forgotten in the basement of a county courthouse, among moldy minutes and rural tax books, there was a stack of yellowed pages with a handwritten title in faded ink: The Marrow Creek Widow's Trial Basement. It was not the name of an ordinary lawsuit. It was, in fact, the clearest trace of a silence that spanned generations. The case of 36 travelers who disappeared in the Ozark Highlands in 1903, all of whom had one thing in common: the widow of Marrow Creek. By then, the train had been arriving in the region for over a decade, bringing and taking people, goods, and rumors. Marrow Creek, on the map, was little more than a dot between river bends and rocky hills, surrounded by forests of twisted oak trees and fields that stretched as far as the morning mist allowed. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was a place where the wind blew more than people, and where every unfamiliar face was noticed, commented on, and catalogued in the community's memory. It is in this setting that the figure of Margaret Hale emerges, known in the records as Mrs. Hale, widow, keeper of boarding house. She was not a character in a novel, but a woman of flesh, bones, and weariness. She had arrived in Marrow Creek a few years earlier, coming from a brief marriage and early mourning. Her husband, according to newspaper clippings, had died in a mining accident in another county, leaving her with little money and a surname too heavy to carry alone. Margaret would have been around 35 when the first travelers began to record her name in guest books. Contemporary accounts, in letters, diary entries, and rare preserved notes, converge on an almost unanimous portrait: a woman of restrained expression, polite manners, discreet clothing, and hands marked by constant work. She was not described as beautiful, but as someone to whom one could entrust the key to one's suitcase and a night's rest after a long journey. The house she managed was on a gentle hill, a few minutes' walk from the small Marrow Creek station. It was made of wood darkened by time, with a steep roof, a narrow porch, and a row of front windows that, on some mornings, reflected the sun as if they were watchful eyes. Behind it, a strip of land sloped down toward an old barn and further down to the narrow stream that gave the town its name. Beneath the house, dug into the earth and reinforced with stone, was the basement. In documents, it appeared under various names: cellar, storage room, basement. In a single record, written years later, one expression stood out: trial basement. In early 1903, Marrow Creek was a discreet stopover for travelers heading to other parts of the Ozark Highlands. Traveling merchants, catalog salesmen, workers seeking seasonal harvests, men following timber and coal trails, and occasionally, families crossing the region on their way to larger cities. The roads were dirt, the nights were long, and the dangers, though rarely written about, were well known: robberies, accidents, sudden illnesses, unseasonal snowstorms. Within the community, little was said about tragedies. Sunday masses and gatherings at the stores dealt mainly with prices, harvests, and reputations. In this rigid moral framework, the figure of a widow who hosted men alone could easily have become the target of gossip. Curiously, however, letters from residents revealed the opposite. Margaret was seen as necessary to the town. Without Mrs. Hale's house, many travelers would have to sleep on the train or in the open, writes a pastor in a 1902 letter. The widow of Marrow Creek thus appeared as a point of balance between the outside world and the inside world. She provided clean beds, simple meals, strong coffee at dawn, and a roof between the road and home. It was not just a boarding house. It was a kind of filter. Those who came from afar stopped there, rested, caught their breath, and moved on. Some left their names in the logbooks. Others just paid in small change and left before dawn. The archives consulted. Police reports, county records, tax books, and even newspaper advertisements make up a fragmented mosaic of her presence. There are receipts for groceries in her name, mentions of firewood purchases, notes of late property tax payments. In some documents, their name is accompanied by small notes: pays on time when they can, always in mourning, does not participate in public celebrations. The lines are dry, objective, but suggest someone whose life unfolded between practical necessity and discreet isolation. The climate of the region at the time is also not a minor detail. Wet winters, with irregular snowfall and biting winds blowing through the valleys, hot and dusty summers, springs that brought mud and floods to the riverbanks. Marrow Creek lived at this pace of silent extremes. It was either mud or dust, either too cold or too hot. And yet Margaret's small inn maintained a predictable routine, at least until that year when the numbers began to add up. From the perspective of the researcher who, decades later, leafed through that stack of yellowed pages for the first time, what caught his attention at first was not the drama of the case, but its insistence on details. There were lists, lots of lists. Lists of travelers, arrival dates, amounts paid, declared destinations. In some, the lines ended abruptly. In others, they were filled with nervous handwriting, as if someone had written in a hurry, trying to cope with a greater-than-usual flow. Between 1899 and 1903, Margaret's house saw a sharp increase in activity. More trains passing through, more people getting off at the small station, more names scribbled in the notebooks that now lie in archive boxes. There were travelers from Chicago, St. Louis, small rural towns and villages that no longer even appear on current maps. Men who came alone, others who traveled in pairs, trios, some in groups of 4 or 5, all with one thing in common: the widow's house as a confirmed stop. It was only when these lists were cross-referenced with the county's missing persons records that the unease began to take shape. In scattered reports, stored in different folders, were the names of men who, according to their families, had written saying they would pass through Marrow Creek and were never seen again. Intercepted letters, unanswered telegrams, inquiries made at train stations, horsemen sent in search of news. Gradually, these names began to echo within the same record books at Margaret's house. 36 of them. 36 travelers whose last documented appearances converged, in some way, on that isolated inn on the slopes of the Ozark Highlands. Some had arrival dates, but no departure dates. Others did not appear by name, but were described in statements as the group of 4 men who got off the train on a rainy night and walked up toward the widow's house. There was no direct statement in the archives linking Margaret to their permanent absence, but the gap between one record and another, between a letter promising a return and the silence that followed, was in itself a kind of evidence. The strangest detail, however, was not in the lists of names, but in a floor plan attached to a late file, dated almost 2 decades after the first disappearances. In the drawing, hand-drawn by a county surveyor, Margaret's house appeared with all its rooms properly identified: porch, dining room, guest rooms, kitchen, pantry. In the basement, the cellar was divided into 2 rooms. One of them had the usual note, storage. The other, isolated by thicker walls, had a designation written in small but legible letters: trial basement. None of the records clearly explained why that underground room had been given that name, nor what kind of trials might have taken place there. And it was at this point, between the geometric coldness of that drawing and the absence of answers in the testimonies, that the case of the Marrow Creek widow ceased to be just a forgotten file and became an enigma. How could such a small house in such a quiet town be linked to the missing trail of 36 travelers, and to a basement that, according to the documents, seemed to have been built not only to store things, but to decide destinies? To understand the magnitude of the events of 1903, one must go back a few years and observe the routine of Marrow Creek when the presence of travelers was still manageable, and Margaret Hale's house functioned as a simple, almost informal support point for those who arrived exhausted from the trails that cut through the Ozark Highlands. On spring mornings, even before the fog had lifted over the creek, Margaret could be seen on the porch, sweeping the wooden boards with short, precise movements. She wore dark dresses, always buttoned up to the neck, and a worn apron that she only changed when she had important guests, which in Marrow Creek meant anyone who wasn't from the community itself. She greeted passers-by with a discreet nod, but almost never initiated conversation. She was a quiet presence, integrated into the landscape like a natural element of the town. The house had its own routine, almost rustic. On Sundays, The smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the smell of burning wood from the coal stove. On Tuesdays, she washed clothes in the stream, rubbing them on large rocks while watching the minimal movement of the village. On Wednesdays, she would walk up to the station to pick up packages and occasionally hear the news that travelers brought. Everything she did methodically, almost calculatedly, as if each task were a commitment to herself and to the memory of her dead husband. Neighbors described her as hard-working, reserved and unfailingly accurate in her accounts. Some saw her as a woman who carried more weight on her shoulders than she admitted, but who never complained. Others thought she carried something else, not a secret, but a kind of internal wall that separated her from the rest of the community. In a letter from 1901, a teacher from a neighboring town mentions, after a short visit, that Margaret looked at people as if measuring distances, not as if seeking closeness. This observation, small and almost irrelevant at the time, took on another dimension when the case of the disappearances came to light decades later. Until 1900, there were few guests, 3 or 4 a month, sometimes fewer. Most were seasonal workers who stayed for a night or two and then moved on. Margaret prepared simple meals for them: corn broth, cooked beans, salted meat when available, and coffee strong enough to revive anyone facing long stretches of road. Many left small thank you notes in the guest books: good food, clean bed, fair treatment. But starting in 1901, something changed in the flow of the region. A new railroad line was inaugurated, bringing previously isolated counties closer together. News of job opportunities at nearby sawmills attracted men from other cities. The roads began to see more wagons, more horsemen, more traveling merchants. And Margaret's house, being close to the station, became an almost obligatory stopping point. There were nights when all the rooms were occupied, and the dining room, lit only by oil lamps, seemed smaller than it really was. Some guests talked among themselves, others ate in silence, watching the hostess as if trying to decipher what lay behind her impassive countenance. Despite the increase in activity, Margaret never hired help. She took care of everything herself: cooking, washing, tidying the rooms, keeping the house in order, and even managing the barn and shopping. When asked, she simply said that she preferred to work rather than depend on strangers. It was a simple answer, and at the same time unexpected for someone who welcomed so many strangers under her own roof. Some residents' testimonies suggest that Margaret avoided joining in the conversations that arose spontaneously among travelers. When asked about the region, she limited herself to practical information: the shortest route to the next village, the train schedule, the best place to cross the creek when it rained. She never talked about her life before arriving in Marrow Creek. She never mentioned her dead husband. She never told personal stories. Gradually, the community grew accustomed to this reserve. It was just her way, a pastor noted in his diary. But there were nuances that would only become more evident in later analysis of the records. For example, despite the large number of guests, neighbors rarely saw any movement in the yard of the house. Almost no one was ever seen saying goodbye on the porch or walking down the trail toward the station. And, curiously, no one seemed to notice this at the time. Another recurring detail in residents' letters was the absence of noises typical of a busy inn. "I never heard loud voices, music, or any discussion coming from the house," a merchant noted in 1902. It was as if all the guests were too quiet, or as if the walls held back any sound. And there were also brief, almost invisible, reports from travelers who mentioned a discomfort that was difficult to explain. A tool salesman wrote that although Margaret's food was decent and sufficient, the atmosphere of the house was strangely quiet, as if the wind avoided touching its windows. Another guest, a traveling salesman from St. Louis, noted that the widow seemed to observe each visitor, not with suspicion, but with a kind of calculated attention, as if evaluating every word spoken. None of this, taken alone, constituted a mystery. It was just the impression of different travelers about a woman who lived in a restrained manner. But when gathered together and aligned with later records, these details form an unsettling mosaic. The basement, for example, a part of the house rarely mentioned by guests, appears only once in a preserved note. One traveler noted that during a storm, he heard footsteps coming from downstairs, as if someone were dragging something heavy. He asked Margaret about it the next day, but she replied only that it must have been the wind. The man noted, "There was no wind that night." Another curious aspect emerged in reports from the neighborhood. No one remembered being invited into the widow's house beyond the dining room. Even in occasional emergencies, such as the flood that hit part of the city in 1902, Margaret offered coffee and shelter on the porch, but avoided allowing residents to actually enter. This behavior, although strange, was seen as simple zeal or modesty. And yet when we follow the increase in the flow of travelers between 1901 and 1903, we realize that something did not add up. People arrived, but few were seen leaving. Some left their names in the registration books, but never reappeared on the roads of the region. The signs were subtle, fragmented, lost in the daily life of a city that relied too much on its own normality. And perhaps that is why no one noticed at the time that the quiet balance of the inn was about to be disrupted. The first formal complaint would only come months later. But before that, amid the sounds of storms, footsteps in the basement, and guests who went to bed too early, there was an uneasy feeling that began to permeate the house, nameless, formless, without clear explanation. It was the kind of discomfort that one feels only for a moment, but which, revisited decades later, seems to herald the movement of something greater, like the prelude to an absence that would become permanent. And it would be on a muggy, humid summer night that the records would make their last clear connection between a group of travelers and the widow's house. The last confirmed point before the disappearance began to take shape in the archives. County records describe the night of August 14, 1903, as high temperature, overcast skies, light winds from the south. The description is simple, but anyone who has lived in the Ozark Highlands knows that nights like these have a particular weight, as if the air, trapped between the valleys, were slow to move, creating a sense of waiting that no one can name. This was the night 4 travelers stepped off the late afternoon train. The station's logbooks identify only 3 full names: Herman Lowe, leather salesman; John Pritchard, itinerant miner; Elliot Crane, young clerk from Kansas City. The 4th man's name was not recorded. The clerk claimed years later that the group was in a hurry and that darkness was already beginning to make writing difficult. The 4 were seen following the trail that led to Margaret Hale's house. The sun had already disappeared behind the mountains, and a low fog was beginning to form over the creek. The damp weather made the wood of the bridge slippery, and the wind, though timid, carried the smell of wet earth, like a harbinger of an approaching storm. On that day, according to preserved notes, the inn had 2 vacant rooms. Margaret had spent the day washing clothes in the stream and preparing preserves in the kitchen. It was a Friday, and on Fridays, as a note left by a traveler years earlier points out, she seemed more tired than usual, as if the week had weighed heavily on her shoulders. The 4 men arrived on the porch shortly after nightfall. The lamp hanging outside cast a yellowish light on the boards and on Margaret's dark dress as she opened the door just enough to see who was knocking. According to a later statement by a farmer who was passing by on the road at the time, the widow spoke briefly with them before letting them in. He described the scene as ordinary, but added a detail that would only gain relevance decades later. She looked at the 4 as if waiting for someone, not as if receiving strangers. Inside the house, the routine seemed to follow its usual pace. Margaret served hot broth, bread, and coffee. The men ate in silence, perhaps exhausted from the journey, perhaps uncomfortable with the quietness of the house. Among them, according to letters found in Crane's belongings years later, there was a growing atmosphere of mistrust, not toward their hostess, but among the group. One of them mentioned, in an incomplete note, that they had had a disagreement during the trip. Around 9 o'clock at night, the light from the lamps began to flicker, a sign that the wick needed to be changed or that the wind outside had picked up. The hot air seemed heavier. The smell of rain began to seep through the cracks in the house. And although no one realized it at the time, that was the last moment the four travelers would be seen alive by anyone in the city. The records become fragmented from this point on, as if at the most crucial moment, history had begun to unravel. But there are clues, small pieces of evidence preserved by chance, that allow us to reconstruct with reasonable accuracy what may have happened in the following hours. A neighbor, whose house was some distance away, reported seeing light in the inn's kitchen around 11 p.m. She said she noticed movement, but could not say for sure whether it was footsteps, shadows, or just the flickering of the lamp. She only said that something seemed to disturb the silence, although she could not identify what it was. Another witness, a pastor returning late from a visit, said he heard a metallic sound coming from the back of the house. It was not the sound of pots and pans, nor of tools. It sounded like something being dragged, repetitive, and it stopped abruptly when he got too close to the trail. He attributed the sound to the movement of animals, but wrote in his diary, "There was something human in the cadence." Shortly before midnight, the rain finally fell. It began with sparse, heavy drops that hit the roof like impatient fingers. Then it came down all at once, and everything in the area was swallowed up by the sound of water running through the gutters, the soggy ground, and the creek that began to rise. At 12:17 a.m., according to the pendulum clock that is now preserved in the county museum, there was a sudden interruption in the movement inside the house. The clock registered a slight deviation, as if it had been moved a few centimeters, the kind of change that occurs when the floor vibrates or when someone passes very close by, carrying something heavy. This seemingly trivial detail was identified decades later by a restorer and noted as accidental evidence of internal displacement. From this point on, events are shrouded in absolute silence. No neighbors heard footsteps. No travelers passing by on the road reported seeing any movement. No lights were seen through the front windows. But there is one specific piece of information, perhaps the most enigmatic of all, found in the inn's guest book. The page for that day has 4 names, those of the travelers. Next to each of them, in the departure column, there are only long lines, as if someone had rubbed out the graffiti with force, but without writing anything. These lines were made the next morning. It is not known by whom. At 5:32 a.m. the next morning, after the rain had stopped, a wagon driver saw Margaret Hale on the porch. She was alone. He greeted her. She nodded in response, as she always did. The man described the porch floor as wet, but too clean for the intensity of the previous night's storm. He saw no suitcases, no boots, no sign of guests. This was the last confirmed report of Margaret before the first missing person report was filed just a few weeks later. The group of 4 travelers never left Marrow Creek that season. Their names do not appear in any hotel, inn, or stagecoach records in the following towns. Their families sent letters, telegrams, requests for investigation, all without response. And, revisiting the archives, the researcher realizes that the silence of that early morning was not just an absence of sound. It was an absence of traces, a kind of gap that opens between 2 lines of records and, from within it, swallows everything that should exist. The last fragment of physical evidence found decades later is even more disturbing. In the foundations of the house, already in ruins, there was a reinforced wooden door, partially buried, that led to an underground compartment. It was not the usual basement, it was the other one, the one identified in the drawing as trial basement, and it was there in front of that door that the files ceased to be just paper and became an echo that seems to come from 1903 and that even today remains unanswered. When the 4 travelers did not return to their hometowns, their absence was initially attributed to the uncertainties of the road. It was common for men looking for work to take weeks longer than expected, or to change routes without sending immediate notice. But as the replies did not arrive, and the families insisted, first by letters, then by telegrams, unease began to spread across counties. The first official complaint filed in the Marrow Creek court dates back to September 28, 1903. It was made by the family of Herman Lowe, the leather salesman. The letter read, "He last wrote saying he would be staying in Marrow Creek. There has been no further correspondence. Please confirm if he passed through the station on the date mentioned. The letter was received, opened, stamped, and placed in a pile that at the time barely filled half a drawer. The town was not accustomed to disappearances. There were deaths in accidents, illnesses, people lost in the woods, but no complete disappearances. Even so, the letter did not prompt an immediate investigation. It was only in mid-October, when 2 more families sent similar inquiries, that the county sheriff decided to visit the widow in Marrow Creek to clarify whether the men had actually stayed there. The report of the visit, though brief, became one of the most scrutinized pieces of the case. In it, the sheriff describes finding Margaret on the porch, sweeping the floor with a calm, perhaps weary expression. He asked about the travelers. She confirmed that she had hosted them, but said that they left early, before dawn. At first glance, the answer seemed plausible. The trail was used by many. The distance to the station was short, and men in a hurry were nothing new. But the sheriff mentions a detail that, at the time, did not alarm him. Margaret did not indicate the direction, the exact time, nor did she comment on the group's behavior. She simply repeated, almost word for word, the same phrase. They left early. The report also mentions that the house was immaculately tidy, with no signs of recent guests. The smell of soap and freshly polished wood dominated the atmosphere. The sheriff reported that he saw no suitcases or bedding out of place. Nothing indicated that 4 men had slept there less than 2 months earlier. Still, the investigation remained superficial. The county had few resources, and authorities were more concerned with land disputes and harvest problems. Margaret's boarding house continued to receive travelers, fewer in number, but still enough to keep the house running. It was only when a sawmill worker passing through Marrow Creek heard informally about the disappearances and found a note among his own belongings that would change the course of the case. It was a folded, yellowed piece of paper found between the pages of a book. The text simply read, "If anything happens to me, I was at the widow's house." The signature was that of John Pritchard, one of the 4 missing travelers. The frightened worker handed the note to the sheriff. From then on, the authorities were forced to return to the inn. Once again, Margaret greeted them calmly. She just smiled, offered them coffee, and repeated the same phrase about the guests having left early. But there was something different this time. According to the second report, she seemed exhausted, as if she had endured nights of interrupted sleep. Her eyes were sunken, and her hands, once steady, shook slightly. The county team asked to inspect the property. Margaret allowed them to enter the main floor, the kitchen, the bedrooms, and even the barn. Nothing caught their attention, nothing out of place, nothing to suggest crime or wrongdoing, until one of the sheriff's deputies found, behind bags of potatoes, a reinforced wooden door that led down to an underground area. It was the basement. Margaret said she kept preserves, tools, and firewood there. The inspection of the main basement area did indeed reveal only boxes, supplies, and ordinary objects. Everything was organized, clean, and quiet. But there was another door, smaller, heavier, with internal hinges. When asked what was behind it, Margaret quickly replied, "Old storage. Nothing useful." Her voice, as noted in the records, broke slightly as she said this. A minimal but noticeable break. The sheriff tried to open it. The door was locked. He asked for the key. Margaret hesitated, for the first time since the investigation began. She touched her apron pocket, then withdrew her hand. She said the key had been lost during the previous year's flood. They did not insist. There was still no legal basis for forcing entry, and the small, overburdened county did not want to wrongfully accuse a woman whom everyone considered hard-working and honest. Suspicions grew when, in the same week, 3 residents reported noises coming from the house on different nights. Not loud sounds, but rhythmic, almost muffled thuds, like wood being handled with care. A neighbor said she saw a light in the basement in the middle of the night, which was unusual for someone who lived alone and woke up before dawn. Meanwhile, new reports arrived by letter. More families, more dates, more missing men. Cross-referencing the records, it was discovered that 36 travelers had passed through Marrow Creek and disappeared without a trace in the last 4 years. The county, finally under pressure, ordered a third visit, this time accompanied by an outside officer. But when they arrived at the house, they found the front door open and the interior empty. There were no signs of a struggle nor of a hasty departure, only silence. Clean dishes in the dish rack, a made bed, a table set for one, and on the kitchen floor near the stove, a dark oval mark, as if something heavy had been placed there recently. The search inside the house led back to the basement, and this time the smaller door, the one that in the documents would be known as the entrance to the trial basement, was ajar. The smell coming from inside was not foul or indicative of decomposition. It was something colder, more metallic, like wet stone and old rust. The lamp partially illuminated the descent. The walls were thicker than those of the house. The floor, unlike the rest of the basement, was leveled by hand. In the center, a dismantled wooden structure, perhaps a bench, perhaps a support. It is not clear. And in the far corner, hidden by the shadows, there was an old iron hook attached to the wall. There was no blood. There were no bones. There were no bodies. But there was silence. A silence so deep that it seemed to fill the space like a presence. The final report describes the environment with just one sentence. We found no conclusive evidence, only absence. Margaret Hale was never seen again. Her name does not appear in any subsequent records, at any station, in any neighboring town. It is as if she had been erased from the map at the same rate as the travelers disappeared. And it was this disappearance, as complete as that of the men, that turned the case of the Marrow Creek widow into one of the region's most disturbing enigmas. However, the most unsettling revelation would only come decades later, when a historian, reviewing old blueprints, noticed that the trial basement did not appear in the original records of the house, only in later versions. Someone added it. Someone drew it. Someone named it. But there is no explanation in any archive as to who did it and why. Today, more than a century later, the case of the widow of Marrow Creek remains suspended in time, an interval between facts, a space where history seems to breathe on its own. All that is known comes from fragile papers, hand-drawn maps, scattered testimonies, and traces that never quite fit together. And yet, when these fragments are pieced together, they form an image that is unclear but impossible to ignore. For those who revisit the archives, the first sensation is not one of violence or police intrigue. It is something more discreet, more profound, a kind of silence that is not found in empty pages, but in what was not written, in the blank space between two dates, between a registered name and a departure that was never noted, in the pages where lines replaced words. The researcher who reconstructs this story, any researcher in any generation, inevitably faces the same question. How could such a small house, in such a quiet community, become the final resting place for 36 lives? There are no maps that answer this question. There are no living witnesses. There are no objects that have stood the test of time with clear answers. There is only a sequence of clues that, although they never constitute proof, accumulate moral weight. Over the years, many have tried to interpret the case through contemporary lenses, theories of serial crimes, abuse, worker trafficking, or clandestine disputes of the time. But all these hypotheses come up against a simple barrier. There is no concrete evidence of violence, no body, no weapon, no stain that the experts of the 1930s, when the files began to be reviewed, could identify. What remains, therefore, is a narrative made up of absences. And perhaps that is why the case of the Marrow Creek widow is so disturbing, because it offers no relief of conclusion. There is no justice served, no proven culprit, no definitive explanation. There is only the echo of something that happened underground on a sweltering summer day in 1903, and that dissolved into time before anyone could record what really happened. Attempts to locate Margaret Hale over the decades have been numerous, but all have been unsuccessful. There are no records of train tickets in her name. No nearby town has reported receiving a woman matching her description. No registry office has recorded her death, her move, or her confinement in an institution. The woman simply disappeared, and in disappearing, she took with her any chance of a complete reconstruction of the facts. Still, the archives reveal something that, although subtle, has always caught the attention of the most experienced researchers. Margaret never defended herself. In no letter, testimony, or subsequent statement is there any attempt to explain, justify, or deny the suspicions. There is no evidence that she sought legal help or asked the county for protection. Is it possible that she was running away from something? Is it possible that she had been threatened, or perhaps she was aware that any explanation she gave would be insufficient in light of the gaps? These questions, like all the others, were left to time, and time returned them only with silence. The trial basement, in turn, became the subject of ongoing speculation. Some believe it was just a reinforced storage room for storm and flood seasons, something common in mountainous regions. Others suggest that the space may have been adapted by a previous or subsequent owner for unknown purposes. The truth is that no one knows, and any theory that attempts to fill this void depends more on imagination than on facts. What can be said with certainty is that the room existed, that its door was thicker than necessary, that the floor seemed to have been leveled by hand, and that, when found, it offered nothing but space, shade, and cool air. In the 1950s, a group of historians visited the site, already in ruins, to try to compare ancient accounts with the remaining structure. One of them, writing about the experience, noted a phrase that has become emblematic. Some places hold echoes that belong to no one, and perhaps that is the central point of this story. Mystery is not always sustained by what happened, but by what we can never say for sure. The travelers did disappear. Their trail ends at the widow's house in Marrow Creek, but what happened between their arrival and their disappearance has been swallowed up by time in a way that no account has been able to recover. Leafing through the last documents, there is a strange, almost physical impression that the case does not end. It dissolves, as if each written line approached an invisible boundary beyond which the story can no longer be told without turning assumptions into facts. And it is precisely at this limit that it remains, unresolved, not entirely lost, but suspended. For the researcher who revisits these papers, and by extension for the viewer who follows the narrative, only a mental landscape remains. An old house built on a discrete elevation, with the river running below and the wind passing through the windows. A house where footsteps echoed, where low voices crossed corridors, where lamps flickered in the darkness of a humid summer. A house that, despite having been empty for decades, still seems to contain a kind of breath. And in the end, perhaps that is the legacy of the story of the widow of Marrow Creek. Not an explanation, but a warning. A reminder that history, the real thing, does not always bow to our need for closure. Sometimes it remains exactly as it was found, incomplete, silent, unsettling. And when the researcher closes the last page of the file, they realize that what haunts them is not what is written, but what was left unsaid. Because some disappearances leave no clues. They leave only silence.